Welcome everyone to the Profit Meets Purpose podcast presented by Constant Method, where we explore how for-profit companies can thrive while supporting nonprofits and their missions. Whether you're a new startup or an existing company trying to launch a product or service aimed at the nonprofit market, this podcast exists to help you discover what it takes to create impact and profit by supporting those who serve others. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Profit Meets Purpose podcast. This is going to be the first in a three-part series talking about the fundamentals of selling to and supporting nonprofits. So today we're going to be talking about the nonprofit market. What do we even mean when we say the term nonprofit? How are they classified? How do they operate differently? And why this is also important to understand. This podcast is for you if you are new as a company or an employee selling to and or supporting nonprofits, or if you just want to get a better understanding of your target market. With me today, I've got the entire Constant Method team, including my colleagues Casey Bowers, who has spent the last 6 years in supporting nonprofits. She is our principal customer success consultant and knows all things nonprofit customer success account management related. We've got my colleague Kevin Kramer, who spent over 20 years in the nonprofit and tech industry for companies like Blackbaud, Virtuous, and Omatic. And he knows everything sales, enablement, training, partnerships. Myself, I'm Mark Cross. I have spent over a decade in selling to and supporting nonprofits across a variety of marketing, business development, and sales roles. And last, but certainly not least, the person that I'm going to start with today, my colleague Maria Clark, who has spent, I don't want to say how long, Maria, we won't reveal
don't say
the actual number, but you spent many years with the American Cancer Society. So you sat in the seat of a nonprofit. The first question we'll kick this off with today, I would love for you to tell us all, when you sat in that seat as a nonprofit and someone was trying to sell to you, how could you tell this is somebody who understands nonprofits and understands the market and who didn't?
Good question. And I think I'll just tell you when I knew they didn't, and that'll give you a clue as to who did. So I think the most important thing is understanding that mission drives everything. It drives decision-making, it drives your messaging, and it really drives the passion of the people that you're sitting across the table from. So you really have to grasp that. And coming straight from that is understanding the budgeting. Nonprofit budgets are not like for-profit budgets. They don't have extra pots that you can draw from, and decision-making on changing a budget trajectory is really hard. There's also departments and figureheads and boards and leaders who all oftentimes play a part in large budget decisions. So understanding like what that threshold is between a regular business decision that potentially a department head can make versus a significant budget request that's going to take a lot higher level approval is really, really critical for you to understand going into it. And if you don't understand, create questions that will give you that information. You know, what else do you fund in your department, or what strategies are you prioritizing in terms of budget and why? And really understanding that whole budgeting process is really critical. Also, the time of year for budgets. Many nonprofits set a budget at the beginning of their fiscal year. And it's hard to change that because they then flip to, we're managing the budget that we set. How's it performing? How's it spending? What's the ROI? And you don't just all of a sudden say, we changed our mind. We're going to try something different. That's a really hard thing to do.
What's a question you could have gotten from somebody, and this is an instant tip-off that like they have no idea what they're talking about, specifically when it comes to budget?
Well, I think like how quickly can you start this project? Instead of understanding like, I know that your fiscal year is X. What does your budgeting process look like? They just jump immediately to when can we start? And assuming that this whole budget decision making is just quite so easy to happen. And that goes back to another point I wanted to make too, is that sometimes vendors come in with the perception that nonprofit leaders are not the same level of professional because they work in a nonprofit. And that's a really, really bad place to start from. Don't be patronizing. These people are passionate and they have chosen to continue to work for a nonprofit, especially those at the leadership level. They often have come up many, many years like myself. And so don't assume that they don't understand basic business principles. They do. They just happen to work and choose to be in a nonprofit. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is really critical is scale. And this is an example I wanted to share. You've got to understand the scale of the nonprofit you're working with. I, at the American Cancer Society, managed our nationwide signature event, which was 1,000 events across the country and, $600-700 million in revenue. And I had a vendor approach me to potentially switch our peer-to-peer event management system. And I asked him why he thought he could handle this event portfolio. And he said, because he had one event that raised over $1 million. So I said, you can switch and guarantee me there will be no blips going from a $1 million event to 4,000 events nationwide and $500 plus $1 million. And that to me was just completely tone deaf.
500, when you mentioned $500 million, it's probably important right now to take a quick step back because that is a lot of money. And we keep talking about nonprofits. And when you say nonprofit, $500 million, I don't think computes with a lot of people when they think about the nonprofit world. So then I'll kick it over to Kevin and just say, because we keep saying nonprofits, let's start all the way at the beginning. What does that term literally mean? Like if the IRS is asking, or what is a nonprofit versus like, what's the everyday layman's term and how do we consider nonprofits?
Yeah, I'll take that one on. Yeah, and I think from when you say nonprofit, there's actually a few different designations. The government sort of has labels 501c, insert number here, and you get different types of nonprofits. Independent of that, those are tax exempt organizations, and how they operate is based on that sort of tax exemption. How they're funded, what they do, those things will be different based on that 501c number. Most of the work when we talk about nonprofits with the groups that we work with are 501c3 organizations that are raising money and getting funding to serve a mission. To Maria's point, the stigma of, hey, they should be doing things for free or they don't have the same business acumen is absolutely false. If you look at the scale she mentioned of $500 million with the events, massive scale, the work that they do is incredibly important. The difference is how they spend their money. There's a stigma that nonprofits should not be, quote unquote, making money or generating revenue. It's absolutely false. That may come from individual contributions, donations. It could come from running events. It could come from memberships. It could come from selling goods and services. But how they spend that money is what's really important. It needs to go back into funding the mission. Some other things that you hear that are a little bit, I think, misleading or part of that stigma with nonprofits is, oh, you shouldn't pay staff a certain amount. And you do hear this like, oh, people that work in nonprofits, Maria mentioned this, there's a decision to work in nonprofits for a reason. They're hyper passionate about solving big problems. Doesn't mean they should get paid less, but folks have this like stigma. Oh, it's nonprofit. You shouldn't pay people. You should use volunteers and so forth. And the reality is they're running a business and it is very complex. I'll use one example and Maria mentioned, don't think less of somebody because they're working for a nonprofit. The work that they do is incredibly complex. And I used to work with Habitat for Humanity with all of the affiliates in North America. And I had one of the executive directors. This was a huge lesson for me selling into nonprofits. And I was trying to sell him fundraising capabilities and I was going to solve all of his, big problems. And he stopped me. He said, Kevin, you know what's top of mind for me? I said, oh my gosh, here it comes. He's going to tell me all the things that I can sell this software. And he's like, man, the price of lumber just went up 40% in the last 2 weeks. And to Maria's point, his budget that they set at the beginning of the year just went out the window, and he had to refigure how to do all of these things. And it was a reality check for me. Like, oh my gosh, they're running a very complex business, but under the nonprofit label, how and where they spend their money, it's not going back to shareholders, it's going back to mission. And I'll double down with Maria around, if you're selling into the nonprofit space, understanding that their drive is to figure out how to generate revenue, whether that's through grants, whether that's through donations, whether that's through, events or memberships, doing that really well and efficiently so they can fund mission and do the service that they're trying to provide is what they're driven to do. So hopefully that gives some context. I know Casey's maybe going to share a little bit more around some of her experience in there as well. But
yeah, I think that's a good transition. Casey, you, if you can, think all the way back to when you started working with nonprofits. So not to, again, give anyone's age, but certainly Maria and Kevin have been in and around this industry for a very long time. Casey, you started working with nonprofits about 6 years ago, and over that time saw a lot of people who were new to the nonprofit world. So putting yourself in that mindset of like, I don't know much about nonprofits, or I'm new to this world, why do you think that is so hard to kind of grasp some of those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I was in for a world of change when I started up 6 years ago working with nonprofits. So I started with for-profits, and their business and the way they ran things was more straightforward when it came to like, they had pain points that they needed to solve for, whether it was like acquiring new employees and how they were going to run that screening process, because that's where I came from, in an HR background before I started with with nonprofits. And it was like, this is what we're purchasing the product for. We just need help in these 3 areas, and you help us onboard, and that's it. It's pretty straightforward. Working with nonprofits, I really realized pretty quickly that it was not as straightforward in the business. When Maria and Kevin are both talking about mission driven, these people that are working at nonprofits are mission driven. And so when I realized is that working with the customers, it was not just about raising money to be able to support the mission. It was truly about digging in to what they were experiencing as individuals that were working at the nonprofits, right? So the people that were boots on the ground, who were volunteers, but also were taking on roles of a director of development, a director of marketing. These people needed help and understanding like a new landscape of fundraising as well. So I wasn't only just learning about nonprofits, I was also learning about how these nonprofits were learning about new channels and ways to fundraise in those channels, very different from direct mail and email. So I got kind of thrown into the fire there with learning both of those aspects. And so learning about the nonprofits, it was really about harnessing and understanding what their emotional pain points were, their day in, day out. They're a team of, even if they're large organizations or they're small organizations, they're a team who has put their heart out there, and what they have to go through is trial and error, if you will. And then they need help and guidance on that. So that's where I really found like, this was not just like a for-profit business where they kind of like, they know their processes, they know their people, they know what they're doing in a channel. It was very, very different there.
One of the things already I hope people are picking up on, and certainly is a part of selling to nonprofits, you all keep talking about missions and how they're mission driven and passionate for these causes. I'll put it out to both Kevin and Maria, because Kevin, I know you've sold to and supported a lot of different mission areas of focus. the landscape of nonprofits, as you've already described, is pretty vast, but so are those missions. Why do you think it's important, or is it important to understand the mission in the context of selling to and supporting these nonprofits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's incredibly important. And I'm going to go out on a limb and actually do something that I used to do with when I would explain just the importance of nonprofits and connecting mission with some companies that I worked with. And I'll use Habitat for Humanity as an example. How many of you have volunteered for Habitat for Humanity? I don't know the answer to this, so if you have, raise your hand.
No.
Okay. Mark, what did you do?
I helped clean up a work site for a home that we were building in college. We volunteered a lot with Habitat for Humanity, but that was the very first one. I spent a whole day cleaning.
Yeah. Cool. Right. The reality is you help put a family in a home. You help put a family in a home. You help give, if it was a family that had kids, you gave those kids a grounded place to grow up. You gave them hope. If you look at their mission, Habitat uses the word hope in their mission statement. If I'm selling into somebody that is driven by that mission of putting families in homes, for me to understand that's their drive and what they show up to work every day, I need to be able to connect the dots to that mission. That was a powerful thing when I, again, sort of learned that when I was selling into Habitats. And then I changed my approach and messaging and sort of understood, hey, when you think about connecting your volunteers to the mission, so maybe they want to support financially with gifts and so forth, that connection was very important in all of my conversations. The other example and I used to work with Make-A-Wish as well. Maria mentioned budgets and the budget cycles and so forth. If I was just making up numbers, if I was selling a solution that was $20,000, $15,000, $100,000, whatever it is, there's a number in there. Somebody explained at Make-A-Wish, they were like, do you realize an average wish costs $7,000 to deliver? If I'm going to spend whatever, insert number here, I have to make a decision. Is that important enough to, for lack of a better term, trade off, pick $7,000? And it's not exactly how they budget, but that's how they think around, hey, I'm trading off potential mission delivery money to do something over here. There has to be a return on that for me, because again, I'm running a business. How I spend the money is really different. And I just bring those things up. Understanding the mission and sort of where they are and what they're trying to do in the world is like really important. And if I'm trying to sell and if I'm tone deaf to that, I think Maria, you mentioned before, like you show up tone deaf, like this is not going to go very far. And so hopefully that's a couple of good examples of just where that mission comes into play. But the other piece, and I'll mention this as a having sold into nonprofits, having credibility is one thing. So I understand how you operate. They're going to have that discussion. Having empathy is a totally other element. And it's really important when and I hate using the word selling because I was never into like selling something to somebody they didn't need. But having empathy to like, hey, I can help you drive your impact. I can help you drive your mission. And let's talk about, if you're going to be able to raise more money, you can deliver more wishes in that one example. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to take a look at mission from a little bit different angle. The passion, and I love that Habitat for Humanity could give a tangible price tag almost to the wish, because that really makes it critical for donors to decide. But mission really drives the approach of your organization. And there's a wide variety. The mission's tied to your brand, it's tied to everything that you do, but there's a difference. So I worked at a large American Cancer Society, a large organization, so many people touched by cancer, everybody knows the name, everybody wants to help once they are, someone in their family's been diagnosed. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a way to connect quickly just because of the name and the mission and the brand. But you have a lot of nonprofits that are doing really, really important things that people don't know or don't understand. We work with a wonderful partner. We've worked with one called To Write Love in Our Arms, which is really dedicated to helping people through depression and potential suicide. But that name doesn't necessarily tell you instantly what that organization is doing. So the approach that you as a vendor might have to take for those different organizations based on their size and their brand and who their target audience is are going to be completely different. So you really have to understand you can't take a basic, overall, not targeted approach and think you're going to find the people that want to support To Write Love in Our Arms compared to who might want to support the American Cancer Society. It's a very different approach, and you really have to understand that when you go into it and help determine who's your target audience, how do you currently reach them, who do you wish you could reach, what are your current channels. That goes back to what Casey was saying. Are there other channels we as a nonprofit haven't thought about, and how could we use those channels? So you really have to dig deep. That mission is not just about the passion, but it's also about all of your business strategies and marketing tactics behind it as well.
Yeah, and all of those examples are extremely timely and relevant. I've also noticed that we're talking a lot about the typical nonprofits. I think people think about when they think about nonprofits, like American Cancer Society, Habitat for Humanity. Those are names that come up when people think about nonprofits. I hope we're going to have people listening to this podcast who are interested in or currently serving nonprofits, and many of them probably trying to sell to a lot of those organizations or finding success with that. One of the things that I know everyone on this call and our team has seen often is we talk to companies who say, we're finding a lot of product market fit with nonprofits, and we'd like to grow and scale and reach this larger, broader nonprofit market. To pivot a little bit here, I'd love to ask Casey, if a company says, we've had a lot of success in helping these types of organizations, these cause and cure organizations or disaster relief, and now we want to just go and sell to higher education or K-12 or arts and cultural organizations. In your experience, is that just an easy transition to make?
No, it's not. They're very different in how they operate. There's things to think through too. So, and now my voice is getting a little foggy, as you can hear. So I think that there's a few things to take into consideration, right? So with the nonprofits that people typically think of, those are cause and cure organizations. So the American Cancer Society, I'll think of some other things like, American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. Those are well-known brands, as y'all mentioned, some of those. Higher education's going to be very different in their approach, in their funding. They're going to do things different in their decision-making process and the urgency and the prioritization. Those three things kind of take into account both nonprofit and higher education. So for instance, nonprofits, they do have a really long process to approve budget and approve new vendors. Mark and Kevin know this all too well. Even Maria, who's been in part of that sales process, is a very lengthy process. But typically what you can do in that sales process is identify what are things coming up for the nonprofits that are important to them. So if they have an upcoming spring event and your sales process back in the fall of the year prior, you can typically use that as your opportunity to help them prioritize getting this approved, because they have something really tangible that they're working towards that they want to make sure that they're set up on that product for prior to. So that creates that sense of urgency for that nonprofit. In higher education, that's going to be a little bit different in what their priorities are, right? And so I've understood from people that I've talked to in higher education is that there's a lot of kind of like nonprofits, there's a lot of stakeholders involved to get approvals, but they're going to be prioritizing things based on, what's coming up in the educational world. So I have more specific examples for the nonprofit because I was in it day in and day out, but in higher education, they're going to have different ways that they don't have maybe as much urgency or prioritization as you can tie it back to the nonprofit. And then another thing to think through, Cause and Cure, when fundraising, they're really working mainly with people who are individual contributors. So donors, fundraisers, those are people who are specifically like tied to the mission, and they have like a reason that they're fundraising for that mission. So to Maria's point, you know, people who have cancer or have loved ones with cancer, they're going to donate to cancer organizations. For higher education, a lot of their funding comes from grants, and their funding comes from, yes, individual contributors, but those are mainly going to be like alumni donations. So those are people who have, you know, been part of the organization and college, and now the college is fundraising. So those are going to be very different ways that you're going to approach people and asking for money and asking for funds for those, you know, two areas between nonprofits and higher education.
Yeah, the budgeting cycle part of it is interesting that you mentioned as well. I talked to a colleague this morning who is selling into a large hospital foundation. Today is January 17th of 2025. The response from their team was, yeah, I think this is something that we could stand up this year. This year being maybe by December of 2025. Because anybody who has sold into or tried to navigate the complexities of healthcare foundations knows, you know, there's a lot of complexity in terms of procurement processes, as well as data compliance and HIPAA compliance. And it's another example of the ways that they find supporters. Kevin, can you, because I know you have some experience in hospital foundations, talk a little bit about, you know, where do they find their supporters versus someone like an American Cancer Society or, you know, a University of Michigan? What makes them unique?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I was involved with, you guys probably don't know this, but I was a volunteer at the Children's Hospital for many years. But I got involved with a fundraising initiative there that was a ton of fun to be around and sort of see that. There's a lot of red tape, I think, in a lot of hospitals. I think first and foremost, one thing about specifically with healthcare and hospitals is there's usually a foundation that's part of the hospital that runs as its separate 501c3. Their focus is to raise funds to do things within the hospital system. And that's different than the hospital, like campus, if you will.
So the hospital, just to clarify, the hospital is making money from the work that, you know, doctors and nurses are doing, and the insurance premiums that they're collecting, all of that. And the foundation is the separate kind of nonprofit fundraising arm of that.
Correct. And you know, getting into what that means, there's probably a lot to unpack in there. I'll touch on a couple of things, but one, the foundation is sort of running as an independent entity underneath this like hospital umbrella, which sounds great, but thinking about things like how and where they get IT support and how they get approvals done and some other things within that umbrella has its own strings and so forth. I think when you think about hospitals, particularly ones that are more, they tend to be local and or regional. You know, when you think about where and how they get support, part of that, and Casey mentioned, like grants is a big initiative in healthcare. I'm not going to touch on grants. As somebody that was selling in there, understanding what their typical mix of funding is really important. If they have a big focus on individual fundraising, that means something. If they're heavily funded on grants, that means something else. If what I'm trying to offer, my solution is focused around fundraising, that means individual fundraising. I need to think about where and how they get an audience of donors, and I'm going to lean into that. To answer your question, within like hospital foundations, thinking about patients that have come through that have had really good experiences is probably a good start. There's a concept, a fundraising initiative called Grateful Patient Programs that sort of leans into this. Not every patient has the ability to give. Some have the ability to give a lot. But understanding who is getting service from your hospital is a great way to look at, hey, who's likely to give to our facility, if you will. I mentioned regional. I think, again, when you look at, if I'm a hospital in Charleston, South Carolina, I'm probably not finding donors that are, over on the West Coast. My audience is here in Charleston. When I run events, probably here in Charleston, sort of leans into who is in this audience here in our region, if that makes sense. Yeah, and I mean, I could keep going on that thread. I think the complexity in there, getting back to understanding your audience. If I go into to talk with a hospital foundation, and I'm not talking about, hey, do you have a grateful patient program? How do you approach, are you doing that? Is that a thought in your mind? And I'm just sort of thinking about generic, like human services, nonprofits, and not leaning into understanding that. If I'm talking to Maria, she's calling my bluff really early on. I'm like, hey, he doesn't know my business. He doesn't know how we operate. And there's a lot of nuance in there. And I think, Mark, you mentioned compliance with hospitals. HIPAA compliance is massive. If you have a data breach or anything like that, there's a massive downside to that. If I don't understand what HIPAA compliance is and what that means from how they approach donors and, or in this case, grateful patient prospects, that's a big gap in sort of understanding the business. Does that answer where you wanted me to go on that? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think what's important here to understand as a part of this is, we talked about nonprofits and what does the word mean and how do they classify themselves? What are those mission areas of focus underneath there and how do they differ and what are those nuanced differences? A little bit about that. There's also this layer to it, which is size of organization. Already the names that we've spoke about are these large, nationwide, in some cases global organizations. But not all nonprofits are large nonprofits that you've heard of. When we think of an addressable market for most technology or services companies that are selling into nonprofits, there are many, many more that are raising much less than that. If a company finds success with one of these large organizations, I think there's a tendency to use those as case studies to say, hey, we can help all nonprofits without really considering the size of those organizations. So I'll put it back on Maria, who represented the American Cancer Society, one of the largest nonprofits in the world. In your opinion, do you think small nonprofits see the success that a vendor may have with the American Cancer Society as like aspirational? Like, oh, if they use this product or service and found success, we may be able to get to that level as well. Maybe not to the global leader in a certain space, but much larger or bigger than we are now.
I think that's a trap, an easy trap to fall into, because my immediate gut reaction is no. Because most small nonprofits literally don't have the resources to ever attain and achieve the success that a large, fully built out, robust legacy organization, they have an infrastructure in place that has been there for years that enables them to achieve the success that you talked about. And so I think it's much more important, even if the results are smaller and feel less impactful. A smaller nonprofit wants to see what a peer organization has done or can achieve. Yes, you want to talk about what you're able to accomplish and how you could scale it to that, but start with what's going to be realistic to them, because it's easy for them to be like, we could never spend that much money. I don't have any people. Our volunteers won't do it. So thanks, go on to the next.
When you say peer organization, what do you mean by peer organization?
I don't think it always has to be a mission peer, but like in terms of the size, the scope, are they regional? Are they national? Do you have similar staff size? And budget. I mean, a large nonprofit, yes, they have budget constraints, but it's a different budget constraint than a small nonprofit who literally has no money. and may have to go find a donor to fund your actual proposal, which is, I think that's what we were talking earlier about nonprofit professionals and how hard they work. When I've told for-profit vendors that come in, like, we have no budget, they'll be like, no, but you mean, like, no, we literally have no budget. If we want to do something, we have to go find a donor for it. And that's where a lot of small nonprofits are at. They need enough money just to keep their brand alive, their doors open if they have an office, their 17 people paid. And so you have to be really creative. And sometimes it's literally going and finding somebody to sponsor the project that you have. Not impossible. And actually, it's sometimes a very good ask because it's very tangible for a donor. Like, we could do X more in our mission if you will fund this, project or program or vendor. So I think just finding ones that are more in the same space in terms of their capacity, their budget, their outreach, and their scope.
And you've talked there a lot about resources in terms of, the people, the budget. I assume you were talking about as well. Casey, as a person who worked with both large and small nonprofits, this podcast very much is centered and focused around vendors, people that are going to be selling to and supporting those nonprofits. Can you talk for a second, when we think about smaller nonprofits in terms of lower budgets, fewer staff, what level of support, if you're a technology or services vendor, should somebody expect to provide to small nonprofits versus those larger nonprofits?
Yeah. So you treat them differently. And I'd say that in a way that says, like, you have to look at their level of expertise in technology. Most of these smaller nonprofits don't necessarily have that level of expertise in technology. So you have to kind of understand where their starting point is, their baseline. And then you also have to kind of understand how your product, how easy it is for them to navigate by themselves. Like, you really want to give them the opportunity to go into your product if you're a SaaS company and a vendor, and get in there and see how easy it is for them to set things up on their own. That gives you your baseline of understanding. And from there, what you can do is you can build out playbooks for those smaller organizations. So I, as a customer success person, was going in and understanding, like, where were there roadblocks for them to understand how easy it is to use the technology and set that up. And when I got so much feedback on, the product, and this is no fault to any company, but companies tend to, when they're building out their products, they build products and they use language that is not necessarily tied to their audience or their customers. And so what you get trapped in is you get caught up in not understanding just natively, when you're logging into a product, how to use the tools. So as a customer success person, while you're working with your product team to adjust that, you might have to build out playbooks for them. Step-by-step guides or even video tutorials are really easy to digest for people. So you can do demonstrations, setting up a video and kind of like walking them through what are the starting points. Don't give them the whole gamut of what they can do. You got to start with what they're trying to focus on. So for instance, if the nonprofit is really just trying to, let's say I'm working with someone who is a director of marketing at a small nonprofit. They're like, I'm just trying to get to know people in this channel. And I'll just use what I'm used to, which is social media. Nonprofits are like, I really want to get to know my donors on social media. And so I would help guide them on, okay, this is how you're going to be able to have visibility and seeing information about those folks. That is just like the initial starting point that they want to just kind of get visibility in the first place. So that's where I talk about like bite-sized chunks of information to give to them to get them started. And then you can ramp them up. You don't want to give them the whole playbook of, this is how you acquire a new donor, and then this is how you get them into your CRM, and then this is what you do with them next. Like, you got to kind of start them off and work your way there.
And this is all after they have become a client of yours, but Kevin, to consider it from the sales perspective, I know Maria talked about right off the bat the complexities around budget, especially for larger nonprofits. So we would assume then that selling to smaller nonprofits who can be more nimble with smaller teams, like that has to be an easier sales process.
Oh, Mark. Yeah.
You fool. Please tell me why that is wrong, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, the budget question is real. You know, if they need to go secure a donor to fund the project, that needs to happen before anything can get done. I've always said this as well, like trying to sell to smaller nonprofit organizations, and I hate that this is the case. But just really quickly, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent because I talk with a lot of folks that are interested in getting into the space, and I'll just use the U.S. 1.5-ish nonprofits in the United States. And I talk with folks, I'm like, oh, where do you want to focus in the market? Well, I don't know, larger nonprofit. What does that mean? Oh, you know, the folks that raise $1 million and above. I'm like, cool, take 90% of that number and throw it out. Now you're dealing with a smaller number. And my point here is most nonprofit organizations are smaller. 90% of them don't raise $1 million. 70% don't raise 500. Large percentage of that don't raise 250,000. Insert to Maria's point, if we're trying to push our mission and fund that, our budgets are much smaller. And so understanding that as a quote unquote, as a seller coming in, a lot of times you have to deal with priorities. What is your highest priority? If it happens to be something that I can help solve, let's talk about how we need to make that happen. I can't come in there and assume you've budgeted this, you know, in your budget that you did in January, or if you're on a fiscal year. I have to understand how you might fund it if it is something that's going to help you. That last question is really important. Do you have a problem that I can solve that's going to advance your mission? If the answer to that is yes, let's talk about how we need to make that happen. I have to also be able to articulate where and how we're going to help them advance the mission. If that's by raising more money so they can fund more mission, cool, let's talk about how to do that. Personally, I always wanted to be really thoughtful about expectations. And I think if you're on the buying side and you hear somebody that says, oh, we can help you go, 20x what you did last year, and they're off the map, that's not going to resonate very well. I've had deals where we actually have had, we need to go search for a funder. We think we have one. As somebody that's selling in there, that's a really hard process. It's not a transactional thing, even though the dollar amount is really small. I'll add one other thing. In that case where you might have, hey, we need to secure a funder, and I'll give one other example as well. But if we need to go secure a funder, where I would lean in is like, how can I help you with explaining what we're trying to do here and how it's going to advance the mission and help the organization? I can't assume that they're going to do that or do it well or have all the information. So that's a really important thing. Again, how am I helping them? If this is a good thing for them, how am I helping them make that easy enough to get the funding or what have you? The other piece, if they have budget, some budget, a lot of times it might be in a generic, hey, we have some budget that we might be able to pull from. The piece that I always found was pretty prevalent is like, cool, this is good. This is interesting, and we could go and do that, but that means I'm not doing something else. There's usually a trade-off. It's not like I've budgeted for all the things. They don't have budget. If they have budget, it's not a lot of budget. There's always that, hey, what are you not doing if you're going to do this thing here? Again, and I hate to keep using selling, but like if I'm helping them advance the mission, understanding at least they have priorities to think about, for me to help them make an educated decision, understanding what they're trying to balance out and me being able to respond to that is really important. Going back to the beginning, being empathetic about what they're trying to do is incredibly important. Understanding what their mission is and why it's important to them, critical to having that kind of conversation.
So I'll pose the last question to Maria and say, we've talked about here foundationally understanding the nuanced difference between types of nonprofits, mission areas of focus, size of organization, all of which are topics we'll expound on and drill down on further as this podcast continues. But summarize for me, what's at risk here? Where does it go wrong? What happens if a company who is trying to sell to or support nonprofits doesn't understand the fundamentals of these topics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the biggest risk is developing a reputation that you haven't done your homework, that you aren't fully aware and really leaned in with the nonprofit that you're speaking with, all of the things that you just said. And the reason that is so risky is the nonprofit world is, I don't want to use the word, but it's incestuous in many ways. Many people move quite often and they stay within the nonprofit world and they take their perceptions and their reactions with them to the new nonprofit. And this has happened to us, good and bad, with the company we were at, where someone moves to another nonprofit and they end up on the demo call. And if you did not treat them respectfully, or they did not feel that you understood your organization in their previous organization, that's the story they're going to tell after the call is done in your current organization. So you really have to be careful and understand that it's a very it's a fast-paced world where people move quite frequently. That's how they move up, in terms of titles and their roles within nonprofits. They like to stay in the same, industry, but maybe they have better opportunities, but they always take their past experiences with them. It could be a good one too. So if you really resonate with a nonprofit and, they're very happy and they're excited and it becomes a great deal, when they go to their next nonprofit, they might recommend you. So just remember that the impression that you leave is a critical one. And even if the deal doesn't work and, it's not something that's going to solve their problems, you don't want to burn that bridge. You want to always keep the door open when the time changes, when your needs change. Can I help you understand? Can I introduce you to other vendors? All of that pays off, I think, in spades down the road because your reputation is everything you've got and the way you treat. And one thing that I always, in the back of my mind when I was in a leadership role, the vendors I wanted to work with were the ones that I liked and respected. And that sounds silly, but if you're going to be on a call with a company every week as you onboard and go into execution, you know what? You want to enjoy your time. You want it to be something that you look forward to. You don't want it to be a call that you hope gets canceled. When that happens, I could see it in my organization when the negativity started creeping in and after the call there were snarky comments. I pretty much could tell you that vendor was not going to last very long. So it's, reputation's everything.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your time. Hopefully everyone listening found this valuable. Our next podcast in this series of fundamentals is going to focus on the individual employees, the personas around that. In the meantime, please, if you enjoyed this, take a moment to rate this podcast on whatever platform you're listening, share this out, connect with us. You can visit us and learn more at constantmethod.com. But in the meantime, thanks, everybody.